There are names that cannot be found on maps, but in memory. Names that pulse beneath the surface of time, nourished by longing and mystery. They are echoes of a world that could have been, the promise of a story we refuse to forget. And among all of them, none resonates with the force of a warning, with the melancholy of a drowned paradise, like that of Atlantis. Our journey does not begin with a ship, but with a man, an elder in Athens of the 4th century before Christ. The city is a boiling cauldron of marble and reason, but in the mind of Plato, disciple of the condemned Socrates, a story brews that, according to him, is not his own. It is an ancient tale, a fragment of truth rescued not by the Greeks, children without memory in his opinion, but by the priests of Egypt, guardians of a time measured in millennia. Plato tells us that his ancestor, the legislator Solon, travelled to the land of the Nile. There, among columns that had witnessed the birth and death of dynasties, an elder priest entrusted him with a forgotten chronicle. The chronicle of an event that occurred 9,000 years before his time, an era so remote that for them it was already a myth. Imagine a continent island beyond the Pillars of Hercules, where geography itself was a symphony. Perfect rings of land and water embracing in a cosmic dance, the work of Poseidon himself. Palaces clad in a metal that burned with the brilliance of fire, the legendary orichalcum. Fields of impossible fertility, invincible armies, and a people who, in their beginnings, carried in their veins the virtue of a god. But time is a slow poison. The blood of the gods soured with human ambition. Virtue withered, and greed flourished like a weed in a perfect garden. The Atlantean kings, drunk with power, launched their fleets against the known world, seeking to impose their will upon everything. In Plato's account, only a prehistoric and heroic Athens dared to confront them, the last bastion of freedom. The war must have been apocalyptic, the clamour of bronze and iron echoing along the shores of the Mediterranean. We can feel the weariness of the soldiers, the terror of the peoples who saw that tide of conquest advancing, believing it unstoppable. And then, when the arrogance of Atlantis touched the sky, the gods or the earth itself responded, not with a battle, but with a single and dreadful act of forgetfulness. In one day and one night of fury, the crust of the world convulsed. The island, with its armies, its treasures, and its pride, was devoured by the sea. It disappeared without a trace, not a tomb, not a ruin, not a fragment of orichalcum, only an impassable sea of mud and a silence of water that has lasted for millennia. This is the story, a fable, a warning, a mythos about pride and downfall. Atlantis as a mirror for all civilizations that believe themselves eternal. But what if it was something more? What if at the heart of this philosophical allegory beats the pulse of a real memory, a distorted echo of a catastrophe that the world forgot, but whose memory refused to die? To unravel the mystery, we must return to the original texts, to the exact words with which Plato invoked this immortal ghost. Memory, like the fog that curls around the hills of Attica, does not always reveal the shape of things. Often, it merely suggests their outline, their weight, the void they left behind. Having evoked the first whisper of the name Atlantis, we must now travel through time, not to an island lost beneath the tide, but to a city of marble and dust, bathed in a golden and ancient light, Athens of the 4th century before Christ. The roar of the Peloponnesian War still echoed in the walls. a bitter echo in the heart of a generation that had witnessed glory and plague, democracy and tyranny. In this world of shattered certainties, a man walked among the olive trees of his academy, a man whose mind sought to order the chaos of the world into perfect forms, into pure ideas. His name was Plato. He had seen his teacher, Socrates, drink the hemlock, condemned by a city that could no longer distinguish wisdom from subversion. And in the soul of Plato, that wound sowed an eternal question: how to build a just society, how to prevent virtue from being corrupted and power from devouring its own children. It is in this quest, in this philosophical melancholy, where we must find the origin of our story, not in an ancient map, but in two texts that flow like tributaries into the same river of mystery, the Timaeus and the Critias. Imagine an Athenian night, the air still, scented with thyme and the distant smoke of hearths. A small group of men gathers. There are Socrates with his inquisitive irony, Timaeus of Locri, a Pythagorean astronomer whose gaze seems to encompass the cosmos, Hermocrates, a Syracusan general who knows the weight of iron and strategy, and Critias, an aristocrat, a man of ancient lineage and hands stained by politics, who carries in his memory a family story. It is Critias who takes the floor. His voice, Plato tells us, weaves a tale that is not his own, but an echo that has traveled through generations, a story that his great-grandfather heard from Solon, the great legislator, who in turn received it from the priests of Sais in the Nile Delta, guardians of chronicles written on stone columns, a story that, he insists, is true. And it speaks of a remote time, 9,000 years before his era, when an original Athens, embodiment of the ideal city-state, faced a formidable power. In the Timaeus, Atlantis is presented almost as a secondary character in a cosmic drama. It is the antithesis of that ancestral and virtuous Athens, an imperial power arising from an island larger than Libya and Asia combined, located beyond the Pillars of Hercules. But it is in the Critias where the island emerges from the mist of myth and takes shape, colour, and life. Plato, through the voice of his relative, describes it with almost architectural precision. Rings of land and sea embracing each other in perfect symmetry, navigable canals, bridges, and at the centre, an acropolis with the royal palace and the temple of Poseidon. He speaks of its walls, clad in metals, brass, tin, and, in the heart of the citadel, the legendary orichalcum, which shone with the brilliance of fire. He describes a fertile land, a civilization of engineers, navigators, and warriors, descendants of the god of the sea. But time, which wears everything away, began to erode its soul. The divine essence of its lineage, Critias tells us, began to dissolve with the generations. Virtue gave way to pride, piety to greed. Its power turned into unbridled ambition, and its armies launched to conquer Europe and Africa. It is here where the story becomes a warning, a mirror for Plato's own Athens, which also knew the intoxication of empire and the bitterness of defeat. And then, when the war between Atlantis and Proto-Athens is about to reach its climax, the narrative halts. The papyrus falls silent. The Critias is an unfinished work, a narrative interrupted just before the catharsis. All that remains is the brief sentence from the Timaeus. There were violent earthquakes and floods, and in a single day and night of misfortune, the island of Atlantis disappeared into the depths of the sea. The consequence of this silence is the birth of legend. Plato bequeathed us a beginning and an end, but denied us the development, leaving a void that human imagination has rushed to fill for more than 2 millennia. Was he transcribing the ashes of a real story, a lost memory of the Bronze Age? Or was he forging an allegory, a fable to illustrate his ideas about justice and decay? We do not know. We only know that with his words, Plato did not draw a map, but planted a seed. And thus, the island, once confined to a philosophical dialogue, began its slow journey through the maps of human imagination, seeking a coast, a stone, a place to be reborn. Its geography, so precise in the text, became the first enigma to solve. Words, once written, leave the hand of the philosopher and embark on their own journey. They cease to be an allegory and become a map, a whispered promise of a land waiting to be rediscovered. Having heard the echo of Critias's voice through the centuries, we are compelled to ask, where was this island? What shape did the world that Plato sketched with such precision take? Let us imagine for a moment that we cross that threshold of stone and mist that the ancients called the Pillars of Hercules. There, in the vast and unknown ocean, we are told that Atlantis lay. It was not a barren rock, but an island continent, larger, we are assured, than Libya and Asia combined. An exaggeration, without a doubt, for the mind of the Athenian of the 4th century before Christ. A way of saying immeasurable. It was the limit of the known world and beyond. Plato does not speak to us of a wild geography. On the contrary, he describes an almost designed landscape, a work of divine engineering. At its heart, an immense rectangular plain, open to the sea to the south, but protected from the cold northern wind by a barrier of majestic mountains. The description suggests a landscape where agricultural life thrived in protection, with the peaks acting as a natural wall that ensured the warmth of its climate. The soil, it is said, was fertile to excess, a green tapestry watered by a network of canals that cut through the land with the precision of a surveyor. And at the center of it all, the metropolis. The capital of Atlantis was not a city that grew chaotically like a tree, but one that unfolded with the symmetry of a stone flower, rings of water and land, like the ripples left by a divine stone falling into the ocean of time. 3 circular canals, 3 walls of salt water, separated 2 concentric rings of land. On the central island, the heart of power, rose the Acropolis with the royal palace and the temple of Poseidon, covered in silver and gold, and within it, the mythical alloy of orichalcum, which shone with the brilliance of fire. The air there must have smelled of salt and damp earth, of metal and exotic flower. The constant sound would not be that of chariot traffic, but the murmur of water, the splashing of the oars of the ships that navigated the canals, passing under stone bridges that connected the rings of land. It was a domesticated geography where nature and civilization did not struggle, but danced in perfect harmony. A land rich in everything, forests to build their triremes, mines to forge their weapons, and pastures where even elephants grazed. A self-sufficient world, a fortified paradise. But where to anchor this dream in the harsh soil of geology? Reason, restless, seeks an anchor in reality. The most obvious location, one that emerges from a literal reading, is somewhere in the Atlantic Ocean. Expeditions have probed its depths, searching for submerged plateaus near the Azores or the Canary Islands. But the seabed keeps an ancient silence and has returned nothing but echoes. Then, the gaze of scholars turned inward toward the Greek world itself. and there they found a wound, a real catastrophe that still resonated in the collective memory. About 1,200 years before Plato, a maritime civilization, opulent and sophisticated, flourished in the Aegean, the Minoan civilization. Its heart beat on the island of Crete, but its pulse was felt throughout the eastern Mediterranean, especially on a small island called Thera, now known as Santorini. Around the year 1600 before Christ, the volcano of Thera erupted with a fury the world had never seen. The day turned into a night of ash and pumice, and a gigantic tsunami swept the coasts of Crete, drowning its palaces and ports. An advanced civilization, master of the seas, annihilated in an instant by fire and water. Could the memory of this tragedy, passed down from generation to generation, have reached the ears of the Egyptian priests and ultimately Plato, transformed and magnified by time? The shape of the circular island described by Plato bears a remarkable resemblance to the flooded caldera that is now Santorini. Other, fainter voices have whispered names like Sardinia, with its mysterious megalithic constructions, or the elusive Tartessos on the southern coast of Spain, a kingdom rich in metals that traded with the Greeks before fading into the mist of history. The search for the geography of Atlantis is perhaps less about finding a point on the map, and more about understanding a pattern that repeats in human history: the rise of great powers and their inevitable fall. Plato's description is so vivid because it speaks not only of an island, but of the archetype of every civilization believed to be eternal. And as the sun sets over the Mediterranean, tinting the ruins of Crete, Mycenae, or the coasts of Anatolia with gold and purple, one wonders if Atlantis is not a place, but a memory. The echo of all the golden ages that time inevitably turns to dust and legend, and whose story intertwines with that of the peoples who lived and died under the same sky. We have traversed the maps drawn by the word of Plato. We have navigated the contours of an island that lives suspended between myth and possibility. But no story, no matter how grand, is born in a vacuum. It grows in the fertile soil of its time, watered by the currents of collective memory, in the shadow of the empires that rise, and the ashes of those that have fallen. To understand the soul of Atlantis, we must pause and listen to the echoes of the world that breathed Plato. We must feel the pulse of the civilizations that were his contemporaries. Athens in the 4th century before Christ was not an isolated island of thought. It was a melting pot, a port where not only ships laden with amphorae and spices docked, but also with stories. Stories whispered by sailors with sun-tanned eyes, tales brought by merchants from the farthest reaches of the known world, and memories etched in the stone of older civilizations. The mind of a philosopher like Plato was a landscape influenced by these winds, marked by the footprints of those who came before. A persistent echo came from the south, carried by the salt and memory of the navigators. It was the ghost of Crete, the Minoan civilization. 1,000 years before Plato walked through the academy, a culture of astonishing sophistication had flourished on that island. Its palaces were not austere fortresses, but labyrinths of light and color, adorned with frescoes of dolphins and youths leaping over bulls. They did not know the iron of war as the Greeks did. Their power resided at sea, in a thalassocracy that dominated the Aegean with its trading fleet, and then silence. A mountain of fire, the island of Thera, erupted in the sea, spewing ash until it darkened the sun and sending colossal waves crashing against the Cretan shores. Did the distorted memory of this catastrophe, the memory of an insular civilization, rich and powerful, annihilated in a day and a night, plant the first seed in the Greek imagination? It is a question that floats in the air like the ash of that ancient volcano. To the east loomed a more recent and tangible shadow, the vast Persian Empire. For the generation of Plato's grandfather, Persia was not a myth, but an existential threat. An empire of immense wealth and power, whose king was believed to be a god on earth, had attempted to subjugate the small world of the Greek city-states. The story of the Persian Wars was the foundational epic of democratic Athens. The tale of a small and virtuous people who, against all odds, defeated an arrogant giant. Does this not resonate in Plato's fable? The primordial Athens, described as morally pure and brave, facing the opulent and expansionist Atlantis. In narrating the war between Atlantis and Athens, Plato was not only looking at a legendary past of 9,000 years, perhaps he was also looking at the recent past, at the echo of the clash of spears at Marathon and the smoke of the burning triremes at Salamis. Atlantis may have been the mythical face of Persian hubris, the excessive arrogance that the gods punish, and finally, the source that Plato himself points to, Egypt, the land of the Nile, immutable and eternal in the eyes of the Greeks, a kingdom of priests who measured time in dynasties and millennia, not in generations. A place where history was not an oral tale, but a hieroglyph carved in stone for eternity. That the story of Atlantis originated from Egypt gave it an unfathomable seal of authority and antiquity. Egypt was the guardian of the memory of the world. When Critias recounts that Solon heard the tale from an Egyptian priest, Plato is dressing his allegory in the mantle of the oldest and most sacred truth that a Greek could conceive. Minoans, Persians, Egyptians. They were not Atlantis, but their stories, their triumphs and their falls formed the cultural atmosphere that Plato breathed. They were the fragments of reality, the pieces of historical memory, with which a master craftsman like him could construct his philosophical mosaic. Atlantis thus emerges, not as a whimsical invention, but as a brilliant construct, a mirror composed of the pieces of other broken mirrors. A magnified reflection of the hopes, fears, and lessons of the real world. And in that mirror, Greek culture would begin to look at itself, to recognize its own virtues, and to fear its own shadows. History, once told, ceased to belong to its creator and embarked on its own journey, integrating into the very soul of Greece, as we will see as we delve into its temples and theaters. Just as a river is nourished by invisible tributaries before revealing its course to the world, Plato's account of Atlantis did not arise from nothing. It drew from the echoes of ancient civilizations, from the faded memory of Crete, and from the secret knowledge whispered by the priests of Sais. But once the philosopher shaped it in his dialogues, once the word was inscribed on papyrus, the story embarked on its own solitary journey. The sun of Hellenic Greece was setting, not in a cataclysm of fire, but in the slow golden twilight of an era. In the gardens of the Academy, where light filtered through the leaves of the olive trees and the marble still retained the warmth of the day, the story of Atlantis was heard for the first time. It was not a tale for children, nor a prayer to the gods of Olympus. It was a lesson, a stern mirror for Athens to contemplate its own virtue and the dangers of hubris. that arrogance which rots the soul of empires. We can imagine the young Aristotle, with a mind as sharp as obsidian, listening to his master, perhaps with a doubt in his gaze, separating the grain of allegory from the chaff of history. For him and for other thinkers, Atlantis was not a place on a map, but a place in the soul, a philosophical construct as useful and as ephemeral as the patterns drawn in the sand. It is said that it was Aristotle himself who sealed its fate with a pithy phrase: "The man who dreamed it was also the one who destroyed it." The story, born from a single mind, would die with it, and so it was, to a large extent. The seed of Atlantis fell on philosophical ground, not in the fertile and dark mud of popular myth. Unlike the exploits of Heracles or the wrath of Poseidon, which lived in the mouths of rhapsodes and in the red figures of craters, Atlantis never found its voice in the agora. It was not sung in symposia to the tune of the lyre, nor was it performed in the theatres of Epidaurus under the light of torches. The peasants sowing wheat in the fields of Boeotia did not look to the sea with the fear that a lost island might emerge. The Athenian soldier, adjusting the weight of his bronze shield, did not think of Atlantean armies, but rather of the steel of Sparta or the sails of Persia. The tale lacked the lineage of the gods. It was too human, too political. It spoke of canals, of laws, and of an ancestral war that, while grand, did not have the divine echo of the Titanomachy. It was a cautionary tale, not a truth carved in the stone of the Parthenon. Therefore, the story of Atlantis did not integrate into Greek mythology. Rather, it floated alongside it, like a ghost ship sighted by a few sentinels in the night. It became a whisper among scholars, a footnote in the commentaries on Plato. Later authors, such as Crantor or Proclus, examined it, defended it, or interpreted it, but always within the silent walls of the library. It was an echo, not a voice, a memory of a memory, preserved not by the faith of a people, but by the curiosity of the wise. As Greece dissolved in the crucible of new empires and the power of Rome cast its stone and law shadow over the Mediterranean, the story of Atlantis receded even further. It hid in the heart of manuscripts, copied by the patient hand of a scribe in Alexandria or in Byzantium. It survived not as a monument, but as ink on parchment, waiting for the thaw of a long winter and the curiosity of other men in other times. The tide of history had submerged it, but unlike the island itself, not forever. But the memory of Greece, like the light of a dead star, took time to extinguish. It still travelled through the void of the centuries, but its warmth was no longer felt on the skin of the world. The ashes of Rome were still warm when a long winter of thought descended upon the West. Libraries burned, and with them, countless lineages of ideas. The stone roads that connected the empire were covered with grass and silence. The world became smaller, darker, an archipelago of fiefs and monasteries surrounded by an ocean of uncertainty. In this twilight landscape, the story of Atlantis did not disappear. It survived. But not as a philosophical debate nor as a historical memory. It survived as a ghost, stripped of its Platonic context and clothed in the garments of the new era. The complete dialogues of Plato, the Timaeus and the Critias, became distant echoes, treasures guarded in the eastern confines of Byzantium, or translated into Arabic in the flourishing cities of Islam. For the Western monk, huddled next to the flickering flame of a candle in the heart of a cold scriptorium, Atlantis arrived through fragments, through second-hand mentions in the texts of other church fathers. And in that journey, history transformed. It was no longer the fable of a primordial and virtuous Athens defeating an expansionist empire. The medieval soul, accustomed to seeing the world as a stage for the struggle between good and evil, interpreted it in its own light. The pride of the Atlantean kings was no longer a civic offense, a hubris against the balance of the polis, but a sin against the one god. The city of concentric rings, with its walls of orichalcum, became a new Babel, a monument to human vanity destined for divine wrath. Its cataclysm, that terrible day and night, merged with the memory of the Great Flood, another solemn warning etched in the collective memory. Atlantis transitioned from being a political allegory to a moral parable. Meanwhile, the maps of the world changed. They were no longer the practical projections of Greek navigators, but theological canvases, the Mappa Mundi, where Jerusalem occupied the center and the edges of the earth were populated with wonders and monsters. In this new cosmos, Atlantis detached itself from the anchor of geography and became a phantom island. It joined a chorus of other legendary places that floated in the imagination of Men, the island of St. Brendan, which an Irish saint travelled to on the back of a whale, the 7 cities of Antillia, founded by bishops fleeing the Muslim conquest, the mythical High Brazil, which appeared and disappeared among the mist. Atlantis was no longer beyond the Pillars of Hercules, a specific, although distant place. Now it resided in the ocean itself, in that Atlantic which for the medieval man was not a route of communication, but the edge of the world, an abyss of perpetual fog and boiling waters. It was the Mare Tenebrosum, the Sea of Darkness. The story of its sinking was not an incentive for exploration, but rather the opposite, a confirmation of the danger that awaited those who dared to challenge the limits imposed by God. The echo of Plato had become the whisper of a tale by the fire, a story to frighten children and remind men of their fragility. Thus, the myth slept for centuries, like a seed beneath the snow. It was not a quest, nor a question, nor even a possibility. It was a warning, a shadow at the edge of the map. But even in the deepest of winters, the idea of a lost land, of unimaginable wealth and forgotten knowledge, does not die completely. It only waits. It waits for the ice to retreat, for the fear of the ocean to transform into curiosity, for man to once again feel the urge to look beyond the horizon. The story of Atlantis had become a promise whispered by the tide, waiting for the men who dared, once more, to weigh anchor and sail westward. The long winter of medieval memory was beginning to yield. From the monasteries, where the echo of Plato had slept among psalms and cold stone, the name of Atlantis descended once more to the ports. It was not a shout, but a persistent whisper, carried by the same wind that filled the sails of the first caravels. In the docks of Lisbon and Palos, the air smelled of salt, fresh tar, and an impatience that had accumulated over centuries. The maps of the known world ended abruptly in an ocean of drawn monsters and Latin warnings. Mare Tenebrosum, the Sea of Darkness. But for a new lineage of men, that darkness was not an end, but a promise. One man, more reader than sailor, more visionary than geographer, walked those docks with the weight of ancient books in his mind. Christopher Columbus was not a mere adventurer in search of spices. He was a man with a feverish conviction, fueled by the readings of Pierre Dailly, of Seneca, and, through them, by the shadow of Plato. In the margins of his copy of Imago Mundi, his annotations reveal a mind seeking to connect the dots between sacred geography and earthly geography. Atlantis was not his confessed destination, not the name he presented to the kings of Castile and Aragon, but its ghost, along with those of other mythical islands like Antilia or the island of the Seven Cities, populated the blank spaces of his mental cosmography. They were echoes of a lost world beyond the Pillars of Hercules, the possibility that the ocean was not a void, but a bridge to a forgotten past. For Columbus and his contemporaries, setting sail to the west was not merely a challenge to distance, but a dialogue with time itself. Let us imagine for a moment the deck of the Santa Maria. The creaking of the wood is the only clock in a time without land. The sailors, rough and superstitious men, gaze at the horizon with a fear that dates back to the origin of memory. What did they think in the silence of the night watch, under a sky of unknown stars? Perhaps of the sea monsters from the bestiaries. But their captain, in his cabin, by the light of a flickering lamp, reviewed his calculations and his legends. He believed in a land on the other side, a land that the ancients knew and that time had erased from the maps, but not entirely from memory. And when the land emerged, green and real against the infinite blue, the question was not only, where are we, but who are they? Observing the Taino people, the first Europeans projected their own fantasies and their oldest legends onto them. Were these the inhabitants of the Indies, or perhaps the descendants of some lost colony, the remnants of a golden age described by poets? The dream of Atlantis, that of a noble and distinct civilization, mingled with the harsh reality of encounter. The New World did not refute Atlantis, it gave it a new home. When it was confirmed that those lands were not Asia, European imagination needed an anchor for that unexpected continent. And the old story of Plato offered a seductive answer. By the middle of the 16th century, thinkers like the Spanish Francisco López de Gomara would propose unequivocally that the Americas were, in fact, the lost Atlantis. The grand ruins of the Aztecs and Incas, their gold, their complex calendars, seemed to confirm the existence of a magnificent civilization that fit with the account of the Greek philosopher. The myth did not die. It crossed the ocean and took new root. But here, the story turns melancholic. The dream of a Platonic utopia was stained with the blood of conquest. The search for a lost paradise, for a city of gold, justified the destruction of others' paradises. The echo of Atlantis, which had propelled ships across the ocean with a promise of wonder, became the murmur that accompanied the clash of steel and the lament of the defeated peoples. The maps of the world were redrawn with brutal precision. The continents took their definitive shape, and the phantom islands vanished one by one with each new voyage. However, Atlantis survived. Its search for a time abandoned the caravels and navigation charts. It took refuge in the silence of libraries, under the light of candles, where Renaissance scholars bent once more over the words of Plato, seeking not a golden island, but a truth of ink and papyrus. Physical exploration gave way to intellectual exploration, and the myth prepared for a new era of interpretations. The ships of the Age of Discoveries had returned, their woods creaking under the weight of the unknown. They brought with them the scent of salt and distant spices, but also the silence of incomplete maps, the vast blank spaces where the ocean kept its secrets. The promise of a land beyond the horizon, whispered in the previous chapter of our history, had given birth to a new world. And in that wake of wonder, in the certainty that the impossible was, after all, navigable, another ancient shadow emerged from the waters of time, the shadow of Atlantis. A new wind was blowing over Europe, a wind that did not smell of the sea, but of dust from ancient books and the incense of the academies. It was the Renaissance, an awakening from a long intellectual winter where men, intoxicated by the newly discovered light of classical antiquity, turned to the past not as a cemetery of ruins, but as a spring of lost wisdom. In the libraries of Florence and Rome, under the flickering candlelight over the parchment, the dust of centuries was shaken off the Greek manuscripts, and with them, the voice of Plato began to speak again. It was a man named Marsilio Ficino, in the Florence of the Medici, who became the guardian of that voice. A scholar with a melancholic soul, who saw in Plato not only a philosopher, but a precursor of a divine truth. When, with the patience of a monk and the passion of a poet, he translated the complete dialogues into Latin, he opened a door that had been closed for 1,000 years, and through that door the echo of Atlantis returned. It was no longer the fragmented tale that had survived in the margins of the Middle Ages. It was the complete narrative, with its splendor and its hubris, its divine justice and its cataclysm. For the Renaissance mind, which had just witnessed Columbus returning from Indies that were not in Asia, the story of Plato acquired a new and chilling verisimilitude. If an entire continent could remain hidden on the other side of the Atlantic, why not another, swallowed by its own waters? Atlantis ceased to be merely a moral allegory about the pride of empires. It became a geographical enigma, a challenge for cartographers and thinkers attempting to draw the true face of the world. It was then that men like the Jesuit Athanasius Kircher appeared, a century later, but a direct heir of this Renaissance curiosity. His mind was a cabinet of wonders, a labyrinth of knowledge where geology mixed with theology and music with mathematics. In his monumental work, Mundus Subterraneus, Kircher not only speculated about Atlantis, he dared to give it shape and place. He drew a map situating the vast island in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, between the Pillars of Hercules and the newly discovered America. It was an act of intellectual faith, an attempt to anchor the myth to the stone and water of the real world. Seeing that map was to feel for a moment the vertigo of a tangible history, a geographical wound, in the heart of the ocean. But it was in misty England where the ghost of Atlantis would find its strangest and most enduring reincarnation. There, a statesman and philosopher, Sir Francis Bacon, listened to the story of Plato not with the longing of an archaeologist, but with the vision of a prophet. He did not look back towards the city of Orichalcum and the circular canals, but forward. In his unfinished work, The New Atlantis, he did not seek the lost island. He dreamed of building it anew. His Atlantis was not an empire of kings and warriors, but a utopia of scientists, a society dedicated to knowledge and the mastery of nature through reason. The House of Solomon, its center of knowledge, was a temple of science, filled with laboratories and experiments. And so, the Renaissance did not find Plato's Atlantis. It did something deeper. It resurrected it and transformed it. It gave it a new lineage. From being a moral warning, it became a geographical possibility, and from there, a social ideal. The Renaissance man, standing between the ancient world he was rediscovering and the modern world he was creating, saw in Atlantis a mirror of his own ambitions, the quest for lost wisdom and the dream of a perfect future. The sunken island was no longer just a memory of stone and ash, preserved in the salt of the words of a philosopher. It had become a promise, a project, a promise that science, with its new and cold tools, would soon attempt to claim or forever debunk. The echo was becoming a question that demanded an answer not from myth, but from the earth itself. The echo of the humanists and dreamers of the Renaissance still resonated in the libraries of Europe when the world changed once again. The candlelight in the studies of scholars was replaced by the colder and more penetrating light of the industrial era. The winter of reason had arrived, not as an end, but as a new beginning, a season of steel and steam, of measures and certainties. Myth, that ancestral mist that enveloped the shores of time, now had to face a new type of scrutiny. That of the scientist. Faith in an ancient text was no longer sufficient. Proof, tangible evidence, the scar on the skin of the planet was demanded. The ocean itself, once a canvas for imagination, became an object of study. Ships no longer carried only explorers with blank maps, but geologists with hammers and oceanographers with probes. The seabed, that deep silence where it was believed the city of the Golden Rings slept, began to be mapped. Its underwater mountain ranges, its abyssal trenches, its plains of ancient mud. Everything was measured, named, stripped of its mystery, and in those meticulous maps, drawn with the cold logic of data, no sunken continent appeared beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The silence of the Atlantic was that of a vast and ancient solitude, not that of a tomb. But the human heart does not easily surrender to the absence of evidence. At the end of the 19th century, a man named Ignatius Donnelly, an American politician and writer, not a trained scientist, attempted to bridge the dream and the new era. In his work, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, he picked up Plato's gauntlet and dressed it in the language of the science of his time. He spoke of geology, of migrations of flora and fauna, of linguistic similarities between cultures separated by oceans. His method was flawed. His conclusions, as we know today, were fanciful. But his voice resonated with an unusual strength. It was not the voice of an academic in his ivory tower, but that of a man who looked at the pyramids of Egypt and those of Mesoamerica, and wondered, with an almost childlike sincerity, if they might be the echo of the same lost song. Donnelly did not find Atlantis, but he replanted it in the soul of a generation that longed for the world, despite all its new and predictable mechanics, to still hold a great secret. It was in another sea, under an older sun, where science would find its most plausible echo. In the Aegean, a Greek archaeologist, Spyridon Marinatos, spent his days not searching for a myth, but unraveling the collapse of a very real civilization, the Minoan. In the 1960s, while excavating on the island of Thera, now known as Santorini, the dust of the centuries began to reveal a terrible and familiar story. Beneath layers and layers of volcanic ash, he found an entire city, Akrotiri, preserved with astonishing fidelity. A Bronze Age metropolis with its multi-story houses, its vibrant frescoes, and its silent streets frozen in the moment of its destruction. The work was slow, methodical. The sound was not that of clashing swords, but the whisper of brushes on ancient plaster, the murmur of men under the relentless sun. Marinatos and his team, understood the scale of the cataclysm. The eruption of the volcano of Thera, around 1600 before Christ, was one of the most violent in human history. It collapsed the center of the island, creating the caldera that today defines its geography, and unleashed tsunamis that swept the coasts of Crete, the heart of Minoan power. An advanced, powerful, and maritime civilization, mortally wounded in a geologically insignificant span of time. One day and one night of misfortune. The Minoan hypothesis was not Plato's Atlantis in its continental scale, but it was its reflection in the mirror of history. It was a distorted memory, perhaps, passed down from generation to generation, from Egyptians to Greeks. A cautionary tale about the fragility of human greatness in the face of the fury of the earth. Science did not offer a lost continent, but the scar of fire in the heart of the Aegean and the echo of a city drowned in ash. For the scientist, it was an elegant and terrible answer. But for many, an answer, however plausible, is the end of a journey. The soul that seeks the infinite does not settle for an island, however magnificent its tragedy. The silence that followed the revelation of Thera was not one of satisfaction for all. It was a void, and in that void, where science had left a space by offering a local solution to a universal myth, other seeds began to grow, darker and more twisted. Whispers that the truth was much greater, and that it was being hidden. There, where science drew a line of silence, where geology and archaeology offered only the empty echo of the tides upon the stone, right there, in that absence, a new undergrowth of stories sprang forth. The 19th century, with the roar of its steam engines and the cold light of gas that drove away ancient shadows, felt a strange nostalgia for the mysteries that its own reason banished. The world longed for an origin, a common source that would explain the scattered ruins of Egypt, of Mesoamerica, of the valleys of the Indus. And in that yearning, Atlantis ceased to be Plato's moral fable and became the answer. The first weaver of this new myth was a man of his time, a politician and American writer named Ignatius Donnelly. In his work, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, published when the winter of 1882 covered the world, there was no caution of the academic. Instead, there was the faith of the convert. Donnelly did not seek to prove a hypothesis. He sought to reveal a lost truth. His book was a vast and feverish tapestry, where each thread, a similar word in two distant languages, the shape of a pyramid here and there, the memory of a flood in opposing myths, was knotted together to form the image of a mother civilization. Donnelly's Atlantis was no longer a warning about hubris, but the cradle of all civilized humanity, a technological paradise destroyed whose fragmented memory survived in our cultures, like shards of a broken mirror that still reflect a glimmer of the sun. His voice did not resonate in the void. It found an echo in souls seeking a spiritual refuge against the relentless advance of materialism. Helena Blavatsky, the enigmatic founder of theosophy, embraced Atlantis at the heart of her cosmology. For her and her followers, gathered in salons wrapped in incense and dim light, the island was not merely a physical place, but a stage in the evolution of human consciousness, the home of one of the root races of humanity. Blavatsky's Atlanteans were not simply men of bronze and orichalcum. They were beings of immense psychic power, guardians of an esoteric wisdom that had been lost to the modern world. The quest was no longer for ruins beneath the sea, but for arcane knowledge, for a spiritual lineage. And so, the idea mutated, like a story told from mouth to mouth by the fire. In the 20th century, it took the form of visions. Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet of Kentucky, dictated in his trances detailed accounts of life in Atlantis. He spoke of power crystals, of advanced technology that we would today call aircraft, and of a society torn by the struggle between spiritual factions. His followers needed no maps or sonars. They were satisfied with faith in the word of a man who seemed to travel in dreams to that submerged past. Atlantis became a prophecy, a warning about the misuse of power that resonated with the anxieties of an atomic age. But in these shadows where yearnings flourish, monsters also lurk. The idea of a superior and lost civilization was hijacked by dark ideologies. Some theorists of Nazism, in their search for a mystical justification for their delusion of racial purity, saw in Atlantis or its Nordic counterpart, Thule, the ancestral homeland of a primordial Aryan race. The memory of the island was perverted into a lineage of ash and steel. The myth, which had been born as a reflection on justice and virtue, was used to justify horror. Atlantis had escaped from the hands of Plato. It no longer belonged to philosophers or geologists. It belonged to the people, to their fears and to their hopes. It had become a popular myth, malleable, capable of being at once a lost utopia, a technological warning, and a source of hidden power. The echo of the sunken island was no longer a whisper in the academies. It had become the raw material of dreams, a blank canvas for the storytellers of the new century to paint their own odysseys. We leave behind the feverish murmur of theories, the ashes of speculations scattered by the winds of the 20th century. We now enter a different silence, a silence populated by older and more solemn ghosts, the one that dwells between the pages of a book. For if Atlantis once sank beneath the waves, it found an eternal refuge, an imperishable archipelago in ink and paper. It survived not as land, but as word. After the long winter of the Middle Ages and the Renaissance rediscovery, the echo of Plato resonated faintly, like a distant bell through the fog. It was literature that took that trembling note and turned it into a symphony. Atlantis ceased to be a mere philosophical anecdote, a warning about hubris, to become a stage for the dreams and fears of a new era. In the early 17th century, the philosopher Francis Bacon did not seek the lost island on the uncertain maps of explorers. He imagined it. In his work, The New Atlantis, he did not look back with nostalgia, but forward with hope. His island, Bensalem, was not an empire fallen due to arrogance, but a scientific utopia, a secret society of wise men dedicated to knowledge. Bacon did not feel the weariness of a king watching his kingdom burn. He felt the pulse of a new world being born. Atlantis was no longer a memory. It was a promise, a beacon. But it was the 19th century, with its steam and iron, its wonder at the depths of the earth and the sea, that gave the myth its modern form. It was Jules Verne who literally immersed us in the dream. Aboard the Nautilus, alongside Captain Nemo, a man as lost and magnificent as the island itself, we descended. We saw, through the thick glass, not an idea, but a city. The abyssal silence was the only shroud over its colossal ruins, temples and aqueducts covered by the slow moss of the centuries. The spectral light of the submarine's beams caressed a desolation that was both terrible and beautiful. Verne did not tell us a story. He took us there. He made us feel the cold of the abyss and the wonder of standing before the bones of a giant. Almost simultaneously, an American politician and writer, Ignatius Donnelly, attempted to wrench Atlantis from fiction and return it to history with an almost feverish faith. His book, Atlantis, The Antediluvian World, was not a novel, but it was read with the held breath of one. With the passion of a prophet, Donnelly wove every myth, every similarity between ancient cultures, into a grand tapestry whose central figure was the lost mother civilization. His prose was not that of a distant academic. It was that of a man convinced he'd found the key to all the mysteries of humanity. His work became the Bible of the modern Atlantean scholar, a text that blurred the boundary between evidence and desire. And yet, perhaps no one understood better the soul of Atlantis, its deep and melancholic truth, than a professor from Oxford who loved ancient myths more than history itself. J.R.R. Tolkien did not need to name the island to invoke it. He called it Numenor. In his tale of the fall, the Akalabeth, all the Platonic tragedy resonates. A blessed people, the shadow of pride growing in the hearts of their kings, the final blasphemy, and the immense wave, sent not by nature, but by divine will, that bends the world and sinks the land beneath the sea forever. Tolkien did not write about Atlantis. He wrote the lament that would have been sung for it, an elegy about memory, loss, and the fragility of all that is built with mortal hands. Thus, literature did not find Atlantis, it rebuilt it. It gave it streets to walk, kings to feel pity or disdain for, and an underwater tomb whose majesty we could imagine. It turned it into a lineage of words, passed from writer to writer, each adding a new layer of paint, a new crack in the stone. The written word had fixed its outline in the mind, giving it weight and shadow. But the century that was born would bring a new form of magic, one that did not require the stillness of reading, but the fascination of dancing shadows on a white wall, promising to make visible what until then could only be dreamed. From the whisper of the printed word, which had kept the echo of Atlantis among the dust and silence of libraries, we moved to a new kind of fire, to a communal bonfire that did not warm hands, but ignited the imagination of millions. The 20th century brought with it the cinematograph, and with it the ability not only to describe, but to show dreams. Atlantis, which had been a philosophical idea, an echo in the memory of men, was about to receive a body of light and shadow. In the darkness of a theatre, an entire civilization could be born and die in 90 minutes. The myth ceased to be an abstraction and became a sensory experience. The first light that illuminated the lost city on screen was often a light of adventure and fantasy, tinged with the vibrant colors of Technicolor. We saw an Atlantis of marble and grandeur, as in George Pal's film from 1961, a city of impossible science and moral decay, where its inhabitants, dressed in pristine white robes, played at being gods and were punished for it. It was a lesson about technology devoid of soul, an echo of Plato's warning that now resonated with the atomic fear of the Cold War. The viewer left the cinema with the image etched in their retina: the great crystal, the uncontrolled energy, the sea swallowing the pride of man. But perhaps it was animation at the beginning of the new millennium that gave it a definitive face for an entire generation. Disney's Atlantis was not just a city, but a complete world, with its own language, an aesthetic that fused the tribal with the futuristic. and a lineage of weary kings, bearers of a power that was both a blessing and a curse. We saw the blue glow of the crystals that brought the submerged city to life. We heard the hum of its flying machines shaped like sea creatures, and we felt the weight of an ancient culture struggling not to be forgotten. For many children, and also for the adults accompanying them, this became the canonical Atlantis, a civilization not of arrogant conquerors, but of guardians of ancient knowledge, isolated from the world for their own protection. The tragedy was no longer just a divine punishment, but the result of a painful choice. Television, with its more measured and expansive narrative, took the myth even further. The city was no longer necessarily an island beneath the Atlantic Ocean. It could be a starship stranded in another galaxy, as in the Stargate saga. The myth thus shed its earthly anchor to become a universal archetype, that of the advanced and lost civilization, the ancestral home from which we were exiled. The name Atlantis became a key, a password that opened doors to stories of technological wonders and deep cosmic mysteries. With each film, with each series, public perception was shaped. The myth became more vivid, more immediate. But in that process, perhaps, it also became more rigid. The imagination of the reader, which had once been free to construct their own cities, of orichalcum beneath the waves, now competed with powerful images designed by art directors and animators. The Atlantis of cinema and television gave us a shared vision, but in return, it took away countless personal versions. The viewer was no longer a solitary explorer in the pages of a book. They were part of a silent congregation, united by the same fleeting vision projected on a screen. And so, the Atlantis of celluloid and pixels merely rekindled an old flame, one that neither books nor legends had managed to extinguish. The thirst to find the real stone beneath the projected image, to touch the cold and damp wall instead of just seeing it. The light of the projector, when it turned off, left a trail of longing. It was an invitation to leave the dark room and turn one's gaze towards the deep and tangible silence of the ocean, where the next chapter of this quest awaited, patient among the sand and oblivion. After the glow of the screens and the echo of the orchestras that brought Atlantis to life in the imagination of the 20th century, a different silence arrives. It is the silence of the disturbed earth, the cold of steel, and the patience of stone. For the search for Atlantis was not merely an exercise of imagination, but also an endeavor of sweat, hope, and dust. A fever that drove men and women to rummage through the forgotten corners of the world with the compass of an ancient philosopher as their only guide. The modern search, armed with shovels and theodolites, has a father. It was not an archaeologist with mud-stained boots, but a man of the 19th century, a politician and writer from Minnesota named Ignatius Donnelly. Sitting in his study, surrounded by books that smelled of leather and time, he did not search with his hands, but with his mind. In his work, Atlantis, the antediluvian world, he wove a colossal tapestry uniting flood myths from disparate continents, linguistic similarities, and architectural parallels. For him, Atlantis was not a moral fable, but the lost motherland, the unique origin of all civilization. His words did not unearth a city, but planted a dream so deep in the Western soul that entire generations set out to seek its physical corroboration. And thus, the march began. The dull sound of the shovel against the damp earth was heard in disparate places, each proclaimed as the true home of the realm of Poseidon. Expeditions ventured into the shallow waters of the Bahamas, following the enigmatic procession of stones of the Bimini Road, a formation that for some was an ancient dock and for others merely the whim of the tide. The silent marshes of Doñana in southern Spain were explored, where it was believed that the sands held the remains of the opulent Tartessos, which some wished to see as Atlantis itself. Men with sun and salt-tanned skin spent their lives chasing shadows beneath the water, deciphering ancient maps, feeling the weight of a longing that was both personal and collective. But of all the places touched by this fever, none resonates with such a potent and melancholic echo as the island of Thera, now Santorini. A white and blue scar in the Aegean. There, in the 1960s, the Greek archaeologist Spyridon Marinatos was not searching for Atlantis. He was searching for the cause of the collapse of Minoan civilization. And he found it. Beneath meters of volcanic ash, he discovered the city of Akrotiri. It was not a metropolis of orichalcum and impossible walls, but a prosperous port city of the Bronze Age, frozen in the moment of its destruction. Imagine the scene, the gentle wind lifting the fine dust, the archaeologist kneeling, brushing away the last vestiges of a millennia-old catastrophe. And what emerges is not the treasure of a king, but life suspended. Frescoes of breathtaking beauty on the walls, fishermen with their nets, antelopes in flowery landscapes, children boxing, jars still on their shelves, streets and houses of 2 and 3 stories. The volcanic dust, like a shroud, had preserved not the myth of power, but the humble truth of everyday existence. A civilization annihilated in a single day of fire and night, whose memory may have traveled through the centuries, from mouth to mouth, until it reached the ears of a sage in Athens. The connection was tempting. An island that disappears, an advanced civilization destroyed by a cataclysm. Was this the historical seed of Plato's legend? For many, the answer was a resounding yes, although the details did not fit perfectly. Thera became the anchor of Atlantis in the real world, a place where myth and geology seemed to shake hands. But the search did not end there, because the myth is greater than any evidence. The search for Atlantis revealed something deeper about us, our yearning for a grand past, our need to believe that beneath the waters of oblivion lies a better world, a warning, a beginning. And when academic archaeology, with its rigor and skepticism, puts away its tools and declares the case closed, or that the evidence is inconclusive, the search does not cease. It simply changes hands. For others arrive those who are not guided by the stratigraphy of the soil, but by maps drawn in dreams and by the conviction that the truth does not always allow itself to be caught in the net of science. And so, while the official expeditions returned empty-handed, with their nets filled only with salt water and silence, the search for Atlantis did not cease. It simply changed hands. It abandoned the offices of universities and research vessels to take refuge in darker, more intimate places. It slipped into the shadows of private libraries, into the whispers of secret societies, into the hearts of men and women who did not need carbon dating or stratigraphic evidence to know that something great had been lost. Here begins the lineage of a different archaeology, an archaeology of the soul. It did not use the shovel and brush, but intuition and analogy. It did not seek cities beneath the mud, but echoes in the well of time. This was the era of alternative archaeology, a realm where myth was not an object of study, but a compass, where the absence of evidence was not a failure, but the very proof of a catastrophe so total that it had erased its own traces. In the twilight of the 19th century, a man named Ignatius Donnelly, a politician and writer with a feverish gaze, sat beneath the light of a gas lamp, and instead of connecting fragments of pottery, connected legends. In the pages of his work, Atlantis, the antediluvian world, he wove a dazzling tapestry. He saw the face of the Atlanteans in the myths of the blonde gods of America, in the pyramids of Egypt and Mexico, in the legends of the Great Flood that resonated from Mesopotamia to the tribes of the Andes. For him, all civilizations were nothing but impoverished airs, pale flowers growing over the grave of a magnificent garden. He was not an archaeologist, but he gave people something that archaeology rarely offers: a total answer, a shared origin story for all humanity. Then, the current grew deeper, more esoteric. The search was no longer guided by ancient maps, but by visions. Men like Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet, reclined on a couch and, with closed eyes, traveled through the eons. They spoke of an Atlantis of power crystals, of flying ships, and of a spiritual wisdom that the modern world had forgotten. Their followers did not need to excavate. Their truth lay in the transcriptions of those feverish dreams. When strange formations of straight rock were discovered beneath the turquoise waters of Bimini, they did not see a simple geological formation. They saw the prophesied path, the last vestige of the Golden Age. They felt the cold of the submerged stone, not as geology, but as a relic. Official archaeology, with its monk-like patience and surgeon-like rigor, observed from a distance with a mix of frustration and disdain. Each new alternative theory was a chimera, a shadow that distracted from the slow and laborious task of reconstructing the real past, piece by piece. But they did not fully understand the power of their rival. Science offered fragments, doubts, arid chronologies written in dust and bone. Alternative archaeology offered an epic poem. It offered solace. The idea that we were not alone at our peak, that others once existed, wiser, greater, and that their knowledge, their spirit, perhaps had not been entirely lost. It merely slept, waiting beneath the waves. These seekers were not mere dreamers. They were the guardians of human nostalgia, that perpetual longing for a lost Eden, for a time before the fracture. Their work was not to unearth a city, but to keep an idea alive. An idea so powerful that, although science relegated it to the realm of fantasy, it refused to die. On the contrary, it took deeper roots in the fertile ground of popular imagination. And from those roots, invisible to the academic eye, the myth began to bloom again, no longer just in dusty books, but in the flickering light of the new bonfires of the 20th century, infecting art, music, and the stories people told to make sense of the world. Atlantis had found its safest refuge, the human heart. Thus, the whisper that escaped from the worn maps of alternative archaeology, that voice that spoke of power crystals and lost lineages, found no ground in academia, but rather in a much more fertile field, the collective soul of an era hungry for wonders. Atlantis, rejected by the cold logic of stone and carbon, was reborn not as a place in the ocean, but as a state of the soul, an inner landscape that popular culture hurried to map with an almost religious devotion. The legend left the philosopher's parchment, to engrave itself on the painter's canvas, in the musician's score, and over time, in the binary code of virtual worlds. Visual art was the first to drink from this ancient source. Painters no longer attempted to reconstruct the city according to Plato's strict description, with its rings of land and water. They freed themselves from that geometry. In their works, Atlantis became a feverish vision, a city of an impossible white under a foreign sun, with towers that scratched clouds of a color that does not belong to our sky. We see the shine of orichalcum not as a metal, but as an inner light emanating from the buildings themselves. We see the murmur of water in perfect channels and, in the faces of its inhabitants, a serenity that is both admirable and strangely unsettling. But alongside utopia, art also painted catastrophe. The canvas filled with the sky, reddened by volcanic ash, with the colossal wave curving over crystal spires, with the silent scream of a civilization sinking into a dark abyss, taking with it all its secrets. The artist did not document an event. He painted a universal loss, our loss. Then came sound. Music, more than any other art, became the echo of that abyssal silence. What did Atlantis sound like? For some, it was a grand symphony, a fanfare of noble metals celebrating the power of a perfect empire. For others, it was a melancholic melody, played with forgotten instruments, a lullaby for a civilization sleeping beneath the sea. In the 1960s, a simple folk song, with its soft voice and dreamy chord progression, narrated the myth as if it were a tale told by the fire. "Hail Atlantis!" sang a generation seeking in the past a purity it could not find in its present. Music needed no proof. It sufficed with emotion, with that pang of nostalgia for a home we have never known. It became the soundtrack of our collective yearning. And then, popular culture took a step further. It no longer settled for observing or listening. It wanted to walk through its streets. Video games offered that key. Suddenly, Atlantis ceased to be a static image or a fleeting melody. It became an explorable labyrinth, a living stage filled with digital ecosystems and characters programmed to remember. The player, with the controller in hand, becomes an archaeologist of time, a digital witness to glory and downfall. He searches for artifacts, deciphers inscriptions in a dead language, and often it is he who unknowingly activates the mechanism of destruction. He experiences arrogance and its consequence. In these worlds, Atlantis is not a lesson in history, but a personal and untransferable experience, an implanted memory. It is the great paradox. The further Atlantis drifts from historical possibility, the closer it comes to our cultural need. It has shed its geographical anchor to become a floating symbol, a perfect mirror. In its crystal walls and wise kings, or in its punished arrogance, we project our own utopias and our deepest fears of collapse, of uncontrolled technology, of oblivion. The myth no longer belongs to Plato. It belongs to all of us. And in that vision of an almost magical technology, of a science that bordered on the divine, it began to sow a new seed. Popular imagination, when looking back at that advanced past, could not help but turn its head and look toward the future. The echo of Atlantis no longer resonated solely from the depth of the past, but began to call from the stars as well. The echo of the myth, which resonates in the art and music of our time as we have seen, finds a particular sanctuary, a home both strange and familiar in the realms of science fiction. Here, in this kingdom, where the possible and the impossible dance together under invented moons, Atlantis ceases to be a mere archaeological memory or a footnote in the dialogues of Plato. It sheds the moss of the centuries and adorns itself with the cold light of distant stars and the metallic sheen of dreamed or feared futures. The 20th century, with its breath of steel and its atomic shadow, was the fertile ground for this new sowing. Humanity, which learned to fly higher than birds, also learned to forge fires capable of consuming the world. In this new landscape of wonder and dread, the narrators of the possible, the architects of hypothetical tomorrows, took the clay of the Atlantean myth to shape their own warnings and their own utopias. They no longer asked so much where Atlantis was, but what it was and what it could become again. The first to bring his lantern to those submerged ruins was perhaps Captain Nemo of Jules Verne. In the silent depths of the ocean, aboard his Nautilus, the man who had renounced the land of men stops before the vision of a dead city. The spectral light of his beams traverses ruined temples and broken aqueducts, an abyssal Pompeii, where marine life has claimed the stone carved by hands long turned to dust. In that moment, Verne not only offers us an adventure, he offers us an elegy. Atlantis is the symbol of fallen greatness, a solemn reminder for an outcast of civilization that every empire, no matter how magnificent, carries within its heart the weight of its own finitude. From there, Atlantis became a blank canvas for the greatest ambitions and the deepest fears of the technological era. In some narratives, it is a utopia of advanced science. Its citizens mastered the energy of crystals, traveled in silent ships, and had transcended illness. It was the lost paradise, not due to the wrath of the gods, but because of a cosmic or geological cataclysm, an undeserved tragedy. In these stories, Atlantis is the embodiment of a potential that present humanity is just beginning to glimpse, a dream of what we could become if we chose the path of wisdom. But more often, science fiction recovers the moral core of Plato's account. Atlantis is, in these versions, a dark mirror. Its advanced technology did not bring peace, but rather unbridled arrogance. Its power was not used for the common good, but for conquest and oppression. Its fall, then, is not an accident, but a consequence. A civilizational suicide. These stories, written under the threat of the Cold War and nuclear destruction, used the sunken island as a direct parable. They warned us that our own towers of glass and steel, our own atomic arsenals, could lead us to the same fate of fire and water. The weariness of the Atlantean soldier, weary of imperial wars and the doubt of the king, blind to the crack opening beneath his throne, become the weariness and doubt of our own time. Science fiction gave Atlantis a new lineage. It turned it into the cradle of an antediluvian humanity, into the colony of star travelers, into the source of forgotten knowledge that explains the pyramids and monoliths of the world. The island was no longer just a lost civilization, but the seed of our own. In this way, the genre explored ideas about the origin, destiny, and genetic memory of our species, wondering if at the bottom of our collective consciousness lies the echo of a great catastrophe, the murmur of waves closing over a golden age. Thus, Atlantis was transformed. It ceased to be a place on a map to become a floating symbol in the vast ocean of human imagination. It no longer mattered whether its foundations were of rock or of fiction. Its purpose was to reflect the present. The sunken island became the spectre of our own cities, of our own fragile pride, suspended over the abyss of an uncertain future. And in doing so, without fully seeking it, science fiction returned Atlantis to its original cradle, not to a seabed, but to the realm of philosophy, to the eternal debate about the nature of the ideal society and the seeds of its own ruin. We have seen how the echo of Atlantis resonated in futures of steel and stars, in ships that sailed through cosmic voids in search of a lost origin. But long before imagination adorned it with impossible metals, the lost island was already a territory of the soul, a landscape for the mind. Its first home was not the ocean floor, but the silent and ordered world of philosophy. In the twilight of classical Athens, under the golden and dusty light of Attica, Plato did not weave a map for sailors, but a mirror for citizens. His Atlantis, narrated through the ancestral voice of Critias, was not an invitation to adventure, but a solemn warning. The philosopher, with his gaze lost on the horizon of ideas, did not describe a civilization for us to find, but for us to find ourselves within it. Atlantis was the other, the dark reflection of his beloved idealized Athens. One was modest, virtuous, governed by reason. The other, the island of Poseidon, was a colossus of material power, a marvel of engineering and wealth. Its canals shone under the sun, its walls were clad in orichalcum, and the sound of the iron of its armies was like a constant thunder. But pride, like a salty fog, had corroded the gold of their hearts. The hubris, that arrogance which the gods do not forgive, had poisoned their divine lineage. Their fall was not merely a geological cataclysm. It was the moral collapse of a civilization that had forgotten moderation. Plato bequeathed us a ghost, a city submerged in the sea of time, to teach us that power without virtue is merely the prelude to ash. Centuries passed. The echo of Plato weakened, blending with the murmur of other times. And then, when the world was widening with the creaking of the sails of explorers, a man sat by candlelight in a foggy England. Francis Bacon, chancellor and philosopher, took the fragments of the myth and gave them a new purpose. His new Atlantis was not a warning, but a promise. The island of Bensalem, hidden behind a veil of fog and secrets, was not a decadent empire, but a scientific utopia. Its power did not reside in armies, but in knowledge. In the House of Solomon, its wise men did not seek to conquer the world, but to understand it. Bacon did not seek ruins beneath the sea. He built a lighthouse upon them. He took the name of Atlantis, its aura of mystery and grandeur, and transformed it into a symbol of human hope, the faith that reason and science could build a paradise on earth. But the spectre of Atlantis is dual. It is both the promise of utopia and the certainty of winter. For every thinker who saw it as an ideal to be reached, there was another who felt it as a premonition. Atlantis is the whisper in the ear of the victorious king, the moss that grows on the stone of the most magnificent monument. Every empire that has raised its towers toward the sky has felt, at some point, the cold of the tide rising at its feet. The story of the sunken island became the definitive metaphor for decay. It is not merely an academic debate. It is a question posed by the weary soldier as he gazes upon the walls of the city he defends, wondering if they will withstand the passage of time. It is the doubt of the craftsman polishing a jewel, wondering for whom it will shine when he is nothing but dust. Atlantis reminds us that civilization is a fragile construction, a temporary island in the vast ocean of chaos and oblivion. Thus, Atlantis became more than a legend. It transformed into a tool of thought, a touchstone with which to measure the ambitions and fears of each era, a stage where humanity rehearses its dreams of perfection and performs, time and again, its inevitable tragedy. This exercise of thought, this game of building and destroying worlds in the mind, often left a void, a nostalgia for something more than mere logic. If Atlantis was a philosophical ideal, could it not also be a spiritual memory, a lost home, not only for the polis, but for the soul? This question would lead many down different paths, beyond reason and into the misty realms of faith and esotericism. When philosophy exhausted its questions about the perfect city, when the echo of utopia faded in the halls of reason, the human soul, with its unquenchable thirst, sought a new vessel for the myth. The account of Plato, which had served as both a warning and an ideal, began to transform. It ceased to be an allegory and became a lost memory, a whispered inheritance not in the texts of stone, but in the very blood of humanity. The cold steel of 19th century rationalism, which promised to explain everything with steam engines and physical laws, had left a void in the heart of man, a longing for mystery, for a deeper and more sacred history than that which was taught in the academies. It was in this fertile ground of spiritual nostalgia where Atlantis took new roots, not as an island in the ocean, but as a homeland of the soul. The first impulse came from men like Ignatius Donnelly, who in 1882 attempted to dress the legend in the garb of science, proposing it as the mother of all civilizations. But it was in esoteric circles where the myth flourished with overwhelming force. Helena Blavatsky, the enigmatic founder of Theosophy, did not see in Atlantis a mere advanced civilization, but the home of one of the great root races of humanity. In the pages of her secret doctrine, Plato's island becomes an immense continent inhabited by giants of formidable psychic powers, beings who communicated through telepathy and manipulated the forces of nature. Her Atlantis did not fall due to mere military arrogance, but because of moral and spiritual decay, due to the use of black magic and the selfishness that corrupted its divine lineage. For the Theosophists, we were not mere descendants of primates, but the reincarnated souls of those fallen Atlanteans, carrying within us the echo of their greatness and the scar of their failure. History was no longer a line of kings and battles, but a cosmic drama of evolving souls, and Atlantis was its second act. This idea, powerful and comforting, spread like mist on a winter morning. Rudolf Steiner, who would separate from theosophy to found anthroposophy, would further refine the vision. He spoke of different Atlantean epochs, of how their inhabitants perceived the world not with physical eyes, but with dreamlike clairvoyance, living among the fluid forms of the ether. For Steiner and his followers, the story of Atlantis was the story of the spirit's descent into matter, a necessary step in the long journey of the soul towards self-awareness. On the other side of the Atlantic, in 20th century America, a photographer from Kentucky named Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet, would give the myth its most popular and enduring form. Lying on a couch in a deep trance state, Cayce dictated readings that, according to him, came from a universal memory, the Akashic records. In these visions, Atlantis emerged as a technologically astonishing civilization. He described power crystals, the Twaoi, capable of generating energy for flying vehicles and rejuvenating the human body. It was an image that resonated with the new era of electricity and atomic energy. But, as in all versions of the story, the end was ash. The catastrophe, according to Casey, was provoked by greed and the struggle between factions that overloaded the crystals, unleashing destructive forces that shook the Earth's crust. Thousands of his followers believed they recognized themselves in these readings, feeling the weight of a past life as priests, scientists, or soldiers on the doomed island. Thus, Atlantis ceased to be a place sought with ships and sonars to become an inner landscape. It transformed into an explanation for inexplicable talent, for irrational phobia, for the feeling of not belonging to this world. It was the answer to the silent question that so many asked while gazing at the stars. Where do we truly come from? It was a genealogy of the spirit, a way of feeling that our small and weary life was merely a chapter in a much vaster and older epic. But in this search for a spiritual lineage, in this yearning for a more ancient and pure blood, a shadow lurked, one that would soon leave the realm of spirit to mark with iron and fire the borders of nations. The echo of Atlantis, which had resonated in the circles of spirit and inner light, began to filter into a harder, colder ground, the cornerstone upon which nations build their thrones. A myth is like water. It takes the shape of the vessel that contains it. And in the late 19th century and early 20th century, the vessel was nationalism, a feverish cup yearning to be filled with the blood of an ancient and glorious lineage. The air no longer smelled only of incense and old pages, but of coal and progress, and in the roar of factories, in the screech of new steel, many men felt the nostalgia for a golden silence, for an origin that would justify their destiny. Atlantis ceased to be a philosophical warning and became a family tree. The first to give it this secular, almost political form was a man of his time, Ignatius Donnelly, a populist congressman from the United States. From his office in Washington, perhaps looking at the divisions of a still young and wounded nation, Donnelly did not see in Atlantis a lesson about arrogance, but the lost cradle of all great civilizations. In his book, Atlantis, the Antediluvian World, he proposed that the island was not only real, but the matrix of advanced humanity. Its people, according to him, had been the first kings, the first metallurgists, the first farmers, and their diluted blood ran through the veins of Egyptians, Mayans, and Europeans. It was a theory that offered a common origin, a noble route for a world that felt adrift. But every route, once unearthed, can be used to draw borders. And so it was. What in Donnelly was a dream of universal unity, although based on fantasy, rotted in the hands of others. In Europe, which was rushing toward the abyss of 2 world wars, the idea of a primordial and superior race was a spark waiting for the right wind. Atlantis became the ancestral homeland not of humanity, but of a chosen lineage. Theosophical Aryan theorists in Austria and Germany took the myth and twisted it until it bled ideology. The sunken island was no longer the home of a people punished for their pride, but the lost dwelling of the Aryan race, a Nordic superhumanity, blonde and blue-eyed, whose purity had been corrupted by mixing with inferior peoples. This toxic fantasy found its most terrible expression in Nazi Germany. Heinrich Himmler, the high priest of a dark faith, saw in Atlantis the mystical justification for his plans of racial purging. He founded the Ahnenerbe, the Society of Ancestral Heritage, an organization that mixed archaeology with madness, sending expeditions to the most remote places in the world. His men, dressed in the impeccable black of the SS, did not seek the wisdom of Plato. They sought dolichocephalic skulls in Tibet, runic symbols in the forests of Scandinavia. They sought the material proof that they were the direct heirs of the lords of Atlantis. They did not seek a myth to inspire. They sought a pedigree to justify mass murder. Plato's orichalcum transmuted into the steel of Krupp cannons. The magnificent architecture of the Atlantean capital became the dreamed model for the Germania of Albert Speer. The Atlantean soldier, noble and brave in the account of Critias, was stripped of his humanity and transformed into the archetype of the Übermensch, the Superman without mercy or doubt. Atlantis, in their hands, became the legitimization of conquest, the divine right of a race to claim the world. The fatigue of the soldier that Plato described, the weight of his bronze and leather shield, was replaced by the mechanical march of boots on the pavement of conquered nations. The shadow of the sunken island was cast, long and terrible, over the ash fields of Europe. When the smoke of war finally dissipated, the myth was stained. For decades, speaking of Atlantis as a real place evoked the ghost of the Ahnenurbe, the icy whisper of racial supremacy. The story of the island had become a weapon, and like any weapon, it left a deep scar on the collective memory. Political power had demonstrated its ability to corrupt even the oldest dreams, to turn a fable about the soul into an excuse for the annihilation of the body. Perhaps the lesson was not in the blood of its kings, but in the tremor of the earth that devoured them. Perhaps Plato's warning was not about the purity of a lineage, but about the fragile balance between a civilization and the world that sustains it. The sea, indifferent to flags and anthems, held its own verdict, an ancient silence that we were about to begin to hear again. After the clamor of nationalisms and the use of Atlantis as a banner for a lost lineage, the dust settles. And in the silence that follows the speeches, an older whisper is heard. It is not the voice of kings or ideologues, but a murmur that seems to arise from the very earth, the echo of a warning. Here, in the twilight of our own era of wonders, the myth of Atlantis sheds its political garments and dons the moss and ash of an ecological fable. Plato did not speak of pollution or climate change. Those words did not exist in his vocabulary, but he described something deeper, a disease of the soul that we now recognize in the face of our world. Hybris. The excessive arrogance of believing that nature is a vassal and not a sovereign. The Atlanteans, the philosopher tells us, were master engineers. Their canals, a labyrinth of liquid silver, tamed the landscape. Their ports welcomed ships from all corners. The orichalcum, that metal that shone with fire, was torn from the bowels of the island to adorn their temples. They were a civilization that had bent their environment, and in that victory, they sowed the seed of their own annihilation. We can imagine it, the constant buzzing of the quarries, the hunger of the furnaces melting the metal, the earth itself yielding under the weight of their ambitions. Perhaps the water that filled their canals was not only a trade route, but a wound that weakened the crust of their home. Every block of stone extracted, every tree felled for their fleets, was a small step towards the abyss. They did not see it, just as a man who, awed by the height of his tower, ignores the cracks forming in its foundations. Prosperity was their horizon, and the light of their orichalcum blinded them to the darkness accumulating beneath their feet. We, the children of a technological lineage that would make the Atlanteans pale, listen to this tale and feel a shiver of recognition. We hear the echo of their hammers in the roar of our factories. We see the shine of their orichalcum on the screens that illuminate our nights. We feel the same pride in our blind faith that there will always be a solution, a new invention that mends the fabric of the world we have torn. We have learned to speak with the stars, but we have forgotten how to listen to the language of the ice lamenting at the poles, or the silence of a forest turned to ash. The catastrophe of Atlantis in this modern reading is not so much a divine punishment as an inevitable consequence, a reaction of the very matter. The earth, the sea, the sky, not as vengeful deities, but as a system whose balance was violated beyond all repair. In a single day and a night of misfortune, writes Plato, a terrible phrase in its simplicity. It suggests not a long war, but a sudden collapse. A point of no return crossed without fanfare, followed by absolute silence. The tide that swallowed the island was not an act of wrath, but the simple and crushing physics of water reclaiming its space. Thus, Atlantis ceases to be a place on a lost map to become a mirror of dark water in which our own world is reflected. The search is no longer for stone ruins beneath the ocean, but for the wisdom to prevent our own cities from becoming the next myth. The legend asks us, when does virtue become greed? When does progress turn into self-destruction? The answer is not in ancient texts, but in the air we breathe, in the water we drink. The myth, stripped of its geographical mystery, acquires a new and solemn gravity. It transforms into a lesson, a story told not to entertain children before sleep, but to awaken adults before it is too late. A lesson that we must now learn to teach, to pass on as the most vital of knowledge. And so, the echo of the great cataclysm, the warning that resonates in the tremor of the earth and the advance of the tides, quiets down. It becomes a murmur that seeps into silent rooms, under the pale light that filters through the windows of a classroom. The roar of the ocean that devoured a continent transforms into the whisper of turning pages, in the serene voice of a teacher who traces with chalk, on a board as dark as the abyssal night, a lineage of ideas. Here, in the halls of education, Atlantis suffers its second death, or perhaps its most enduring resurrection. Deprived of its armies of orichalcum and its divine kings, the lost island enters the academic curriculum not as a chapter of history, but as a footnote, a question wrapped in mist. It is a ghost that sits in the back of the classroom, heard by all, but seen by none. In the chair of history, its name is pronounced with careful distance, with the same rigor with which a surgeon wields a scalpel. The teacher, guardian of chronology and verifiable data, presents it not as a place, but as an idea. Atlantis becomes the perfect example of political allegory, an invention of Plato to exalt the virtue of his idealized Athens against an enemy of excessive power and arrogance. It is taught as an exercise in critical thinking, how to distinguish the primary source from the literary echo, how the longing for a glorious past can forge geographies in the mind. The student learns that the absence of evidence is not an invitation to mystery, but the final silence of history. Atlantis, in this context, is a tool to teach the art of doubt to understand that the most seductive maps are often those that lead nowhere. But if we cross the hallway, if we enter the literature classroom, the ghost of the island regains its flesh. The light changes. It is no longer the cold neon of certainty, but the amber glow of metaphor. Here, Atlantis sits alongside Ithaca, Camelot, and El Dorado. It is an archetype. Its story is not measured in geological strata, but in the layers of the human soul. It is the eternal narrative of hubris, of the arrogance that precedes the fall. It is the dream of the perfect utopia corrupted from within, the civilization that, at the height of its power, forgets moderation and unleashes the fury of the elements, or of the gods, who are often the same. Here the question is not whether the stone is real, but what weight it carries in the soul. The weariness of the Atlantean soldier, the doubt of the king who sees how the virtue of his people dissolves like salt in water. All of this becomes material for study, as true as any battle chronicle. And finally, in the philosophy class, history returns home. The circle is completed. The student, who first learned to doubt his existence and then to admire its symbolic power, must now sit in silence and listen to it as Plato intended it to be heard, as a dialogue about justice, the soul of man, and the soul of the city. Atlantis ceases to be an island and becomes a mirror that reflects not a lost empire beneath the waves, but the society that surrounds us, our own ambitions, our own fragility. The cataclysm is not an event of the past, but a perpetual possibility inscribed in the human condition. Thus, the young person leaves the classroom at the end of the day. The setting sun gilds the dust that floats in the air. He does not carry with him the certainty of a sunken city, but the weight of a question. Atlantis is no longer a point on an ancient map, but a coordinate in his own inner landscape. And as he looks at the world, the concrete and glass cities, the lights that flicker in the distance, he may wonder, with a melancholy learned not from books, but from the echo of history, what legends will be told about us when we are but a murmur, a footnote in the curriculum of a future time. The legend, once freed from the book, seeks an anchor in the tangible world. It yearns for a shore, a stone under the sun, a place to pilgrimage to feel, if only for a moment, the vibration of what has been lost. The echo of Atlantis, which has resonated in classrooms and speeches, does not remain suspended in the air of intellect. It descends like a slow fog and settles upon the land and the sea, acquiring weight and substance. The philosophical lesson, the ecological warning, becomes something that can be touched, bought, and sold. The ghost of an empire has become, in certain corners of the world, the sustenance of the living. Let us travel to the Aegean Islands, to the blue and white scar left by an ancient volcano in the sea. In Santorini, the midday sun falls like molten metal upon the domes of the churches and the whitewashed walls that cling to the edge of the caldera. Here, the very air seems to vibrate with a memory of fire and water. The tourist, the modern pilgrim, arrives not with the armor of a hoplite, but with a camera and a pocketbook. He seeks not gold or orichalcum, but a fragment of wonder, a tangible proof that the world still holds secrets beneath its worn skin. He stands on the cliff of Akrotiri, feeling the wind that once carried ash over Crete, and for a moment he believes he brushes against the very edge of legend. And there, at the crossroads between myth and necessity, dwells the local man. The fisherman, whose family has known the tides for generations, now guides tourist boats, pointing with a weathered finger to an indeterminate spot in the deep water. There, he says, the city gate sank. Perhaps he does not believe it, or perhaps the repetition has infused him with a strange faith. His face, marked by the same sun that dried the Minoan ash, reveals a resigned wisdom. He knows that the true treasure is not a sunken city, but the unquenchable longing that brings these foreigners to his shore. The myth pays for the nets, the education of his children, the roof that shelters him in winter. This pattern repeats, with subtle variations, in other places touched by the shadow of Atlantis. On the coasts of Cadiz, where the marshes of Doñana breathe with the slow pulse of the tide, guides speak of a civilization lost beneath the mud, while migratory birds trace indifferent circles in the sky. In the Bahamas, near the so-called Bimini Road, dives are sold to contemplate stones whose geological lineage is less important than their power to ignite the imagination. In the Canary Islands, volcanic watchtowers beyond the ancient pillars of Hercules, legend intertwines with the memory of the Guanche people, weaving a tapestry of mystery that attracts seekers of primordial roots. Myth becomes currency. Memory becomes merchandise. Museums open that delicately, or not mix rigorous archaeology with speculative reconstruction. Souvenir shops offer amulets that mimic the shine of orichalcum, postcards of sunsets over invisible cities. Hotels are built with names that evoke lost grandeur, offering modern comfort over the foundations of a dreamed catastrophe. And in this process, something is gained, and something, inevitably, is lost. A local economy is saved, purpose is given to a community that might otherwise languish in the world's global oblivion. But the whisper of Plato, that solemn warning about hubris and moral decay, risks drowning in the murmur of transactions. The deep melancholy of a civilization annihilated in a single night of misfortune flattens, becoming an attractive slogan, a vacation experience. History, or fable, is consumed rather than understood. The sacred silence of a geological landscape is replaced by the click of cameras and the buzz of drones. Atlantis, which died from the pride of its kings, finds a second life, a strange and ghostly life, in the pragmatic logic of the market. And as the traveller departs with his small treasure of manufactured wonder, the land remains, guarding its true secrets beneath the moss, the stone, and the tide, perhaps waiting for explorers of another kind, armed not with money, but with new ways of seeing in the dark. The murmur of the markets and the ephemeral glow of tourist memories fade away, like a tide receding at dusk. We leave behind the sunny shores where the name of Atlantis is a commodity and venture into a different landscape. A landscape of cold, bluish light emanating from screens, from the deep silence of laboratories, and from the almost inaudible hum of servers that map the world. In the 21st century, the search for the lost island has changed its essence. It is no longer driven by the fervour of mystics or the ambition of conquerors, but by the patient and sometimes melancholic curiosity of science. The new Argonauts do not sail in wooden caravels, but in reinforced hull research vessels. Their eyes do not scan the horizon in search of a misty coast, but are fixed on seismic data, on the readings from side-scan sonar that paints the seabed with strokes of ultrasound. They are geologists, oceanographers, marine archaeologists, men and women of science whose dreams are not made of orichalcum and silver temples, but of magnetic anomalies, coherent stratigraphies, of the improbable yet not impossible signature of right angles beneath millennia of sediment. Their fatigue is not that of the soldier after battle, but that of the academic who has spent a sleepless night chasing a ghost in digital echoes, only to watch it dissolve with the first light of dawn. The most solid theory, the one taught with cautious assent in university classrooms, does not lead us through the pillars of Hercules into the vast Atlantic. It returns us to the Aegean, to the blinding light of the sun over the Cyclades. It takes us to the island of Santorini, or Thera, as it was known in antiquity. There, around 1600 before our era, a civilization flourished, the Minoan civilization. They were a people of sailors, artists, and merchants whose power did not reside in the hoplite phalanx, but in their fleets and unfortified palaces. And then, the volcano that slept beneath their feet awoke. The explosion, one of the most violent witnessed by humanity, collapsed the heart of the island, creating the immense caldera that we admire today. The sky turned to ash, tsunamis swept across the Mediterranean, and the Minoan civilization received a wound from which it would never recover. Modern scholars look at this cataclysm and hear an echo, a distorted echo, magnified and transplanted by time, that may have reached the ears of Egyptian priests and, generations later, to Plato himself. A circular island, an advanced civilization, a naval power, a sudden destruction by fire and water. The bones of Plato's narrative are there, buried beneath the pumice stone. It is not the literal Atlantis, perhaps, but its possible lineage, the historical memory of a real trauma that became a philosophical lesson about hubris. Other hypotheses, like minor tides, continue to lick the shores of academic imagination. Some look toward southern Spain, to the marshes of the Guadalquivir, searching for the remnants of the mythical Tartessos, a culture rich in metals that traded with the Phoenicians before disappearing without a trace, swallowed by silt and time. Others point to the Azores, peaks of an underwater mountain range that could have been larger islands in a different geological past. Or the strange rock formations of Bimini in the Bahamas, submerged stone lines that suggest an order, although nature itself is often an architect of straight lines. The technology of the 21st century, with its power to see the invisible and measure the immense, has brought us a paradox. The more exhaustively we map the ocean floor, the less room there is for a lost continent. Each sonar sweep, each sediment core extracted from the depths, seems to confirm that Atlantis, as a physical place, as an empire of stone and canal, probably never existed outside the mind of Plato. The search has revealed the history of our own planet, the scars of plate tectonics, the submerged valleys and mountains that never felt the weight of a city. And so, modern research, in its rigor, has not killed the myth. It has purified it. It has stripped it of its geographical flesh to reveal its philosophical skeleton. We no longer seek a land beneath the sea, but the origin of a story. The journey is no longer toward a point on the map, but backward in time through cultural memory, seeking the exact moment when a real disaster became an eternal legend. The Atlantis of the 21st century is not a destination, but a question about how we remember, how we forget, and how we turn the ashes of history into the gold of myth. The myth, stripped of its stone anchor, now floats more freely, a question cast not toward the past, but toward the vast and unexplored ocean of tomorrow. We have traveled through the centuries, following the echo of a name whispered for the first time in the dry heat of Athens. We have descended to the depths of the ocean with explorers and dreamers. We have sifted through the sands of time and the pages of forgotten books. The sand has cooled in our hands, and Plato's map, whether real or imaginary, has led us to the edge of our own time. And now, standing on this shore, the question is no longer where Atlantis was, but where it is heading. The future of the myth does not lie beneath the waves, but in the infinite spaces that we are just beginning to build. Atlantis will shed its geographical anchors from the pillars of Hercules and the mud of the Atlantic to become a digital ghost. In a world woven with light and code, its citadel of concentric rings will not be made of orichalcum stone, but of ones and zeros. We will see it reborn in virtual worlds, as an unattainable utopia in a simulation game, or as the fallen server of an ancient network, whose loss is mourned in digital forums as if it were a true catastrophe. The myth will become an algorithm of nostalgia, a template for lost paradises in the vast and immaterial ocean of information. The fatigue of the Atlantean soldier will not be from the weight of bronze, but from the incessant glow of the screen. And when humanity looks up to the stars again, not with the astrology of the ancients, but with the physics of rockets, the myth will travel with us. In the red silence of Mars, or in the icy moons of Jupiter, we will seek signs of life, not only as a biological discovery, but as the confirmation of an ancestral pattern. Perhaps we will search for the Atlantis of Mars, a civilization that flourished and perished under a thinner sky, leaving only ochre dust as a tombstone. The story of an advanced society that succumbed to its own power or to the fury of its world will become the fundamental warning for each new colony, for every outpost in the darkness of the cosmos. The Atlantean king, doubting before the corruption of his people, will be the commander of a space station contemplating the fragility of its glass dome. For Atlantis is no longer a place, it is a wound in the collective memory, a scar that reminds us of our own duality, the ability to build wonders and the inclination to destroy them. Its future is that of a flexible parable, a tale that will adapt to the anxieties of each new generation. When we fear the arrogance of our technology, we will call it Atlantis. When we lament the loss of ancestral wisdom in the face of relentless progress, we will call it Atlantis. When the ice melts and the waters rise, not from the wrath of Poseidon, but from the heat of our own industry, we will see its walls submerge again in the evening news. The myth will survive not despite science, but thanks to it. Each new discovery about the collapse of civilizations, each new climate model, each advance in artificial intelligence that makes us question our own humanity will only add a new layer of moss to its imaginary ruins. Future bards will not sing with lyres, but will program generative narratives. The story of Atlantis will be told by artificial intelligences, which may see in it an echo of their own strange genesis, a warning about creation that surpasses its creator. Thus, the lineage of the myth will not extinguish. It will become more intimate, more personal. It will cease to be an expedition and will become an introspection. Its power will no longer reside in the possibility of being found, but in the certainty that it lives within us, like an echo of salt water in the blood, like the memory of a song whose lyrics we have forgotten, but whose melancholic melody still resonates in the silence. Its future is to be the mirror in which humanity will contemplate, time and again, its greatness and its fragility, as the tide of time rises and falls, indifferent. And in that reflection, we will prepare to hear the end of its story, which is, in truth, the beginning of ours. And so, we arrive at the end of our journey. The campfire that has illuminated our storytelling nights now crackles low. Its flames turn to embers that breathe an ancient warmth. Outside, the night is deep, and the only sound is the distant murmur of the sea, that great guardian of secrets. We have navigated the maps of time, from the academies of Athens to the laboratories of the 21st century, chasing the ghost of an island. And now, in this final vigil, we do not ask where Atlantis is, but what Atlantis is. History, as we remember it, was born in the mind of a philosopher. Plato, already old, with the lighter Athens waning around him, did not bequeath us a treasure map. He bequeathed us a mirror. In the fable of the proud island city, prosperous in its virtue and then corrupted by its power, he did not describe a lost geography, but the eternal landscape of the human soul. Atlantis was, from its conception, a moral lesson dressed in the garb of myth, a warning about hybris, that arrogance that invites the gods to wrath, as relevant to his imperial Athens as it is to us. But stories once told take on a life of their own. They detach from their creator like a child leaving home. The echo of the sunken city resonated beyond the porticos of the academy. It crossed the winter of the Middle Ages, transforming into whispers of blessed islands beyond the horizon. Then, with the Renaissance, it rode the waves alongside explorers. Each new land discovered in the West was, for a moment, the promise of Atlantis rediscovered. It was the dream of a new world that offered not only gold and spices, but perhaps, just perhaps, the proof of an older and wiser human lineage. Over time, Atlantis ceased to be a geographical possibility and became a powerful symbol. It became the blank canvas upon which each era projected its yearnings and fears. For utopians, it was the model of a perfect society. For occultists, the cradle of arcane wisdom, whose survivors sowed the seeds of all great civilizations. For nationalists, a glorious ancestor that justified their ambitions. And for us, in our era of ecological anxieties, it is the somber reminder of a civilization that, at its technological peak, ignored the warnings of nature and paid the ultimate price. Its legacy, therefore, is not measured in ruins of stone covered in moss and coral, but in the persistence of the question it embodies. We have not found its walls of orichalcum, but we have written thousands of books inspired by them. We have not walked through its concentric canals, but we have recreated them in poems, paintings, and films. Atlantis does not dwell at the bottom of the ocean. It dwells in our cultural memory, in that vast archive of the human spirit, where we keep the fables that help us understand ourselves. It is a myth about loss, about the impermanence of the greatest and proudest things. It speaks to us of the silence that follows the roar, of the ash that remains after the fire, of the tide that rises to reclaim what man built upon the sand. Every time we look at a civilization at its zenith, with its towers challenging the sky, the shadow of Atlantis looms as a reminder that every empire, sooner or later, becomes memory. The campfire is almost a bed of grey ashes. The tale has ended. Atlantis will not be found, for it was never lost at sea. It has always been here, within us. It is the inner island of our dreamed perfection and our fear of self-destruction. It is the echo of a melancholic note that resonates throughout history, the story of a humanity that seeks in the past a lost paradise, unaware that the hardest task is to build one in the present. And in the silence that now envelops us, only the eternal rhythm of the waves remains, a slow and solemn pulse, the breath of the planet, which remembers all that we have forgotten.